The Admiral's words still echo in my head, calm, low, and impossible to forget. "Your jacket. It's in my house." For a split second I thought I'd misheard him. A room full of officers stood at attention, the metallic hum of the heating vent filling the silence. He looked straight at me, eyes sharp but not unkind, as if there was something he knew that I didn't. My hands trembled against my seams, but I held formation, staring forward, heart pounding against my uniform. That moment didn't start in an inspection room. It started a week earlier in a storm that felt like it wanted to erase the whole world. It was freezing on base supply duty near Kodiak, the kind of cold that chews through the thickest gloves and makes the sky itself look like steel. The roads were slick with salt and ice, and my breath hung in the cab like fog. We'd been working double shifts for 2 weeks, running supply routes between the base and nearby civilian depots. I pulled into a small general store on the outskirts of town, one of those old Alaskan places with wooden siding and a sign half buried in snow. I just wanted a cup of burnt coffee and 5 minutes of heat before heading back. As I stepped out, I saw him, a boy, maybe 8 or 9, standing outside with a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days. The hood of her coat was too thin for this weather. The boy's lips were purple and his small hands were jammed into his sleeves, shivering. "Ma'am, you folks okay?" I asked, my voice muffled through the scarf. She nodded quickly, embarrassed. "We're fine, just waiting for my brother." His truck broke down, but I could tell she was lying. Their old sedan had frost creeping up the windows, the kind that forms when you've been sitting too long without heat. Inside the store, I bought my coffee and a sandwich. When I came back out, the woman was wiping snow off the boy's hair, whispering something about just a few more minutes. I stood there for a second, coffee steaming in my hands, feeling the wind bite through the thin seam at my collar. I don't know why I did it. I just walked over, unbuttoned my navy jacket, and knelt down in front of the boy. "Here," I said, slipping it over his shoulders. "Keep it zipped. This'll block the wind." His eyes went wide, those clear, bright blue kind of eyes kids have before the world hardens them. "But it's yours," he said, voice trembling. "It's just a jacket," I replied, forcing a small smile. "Stay warm, sailor." His mother's eyes filled instantly. "Ma'am, we can't." "Don't worry about it," I interrupted softly. "I've got another one." It wasn't true. That was my only issued coat, the one with the sewn name tag, Heart. But it felt right, so I gave it, walked back to the truck, and drove off into the gray. By the time I got back to base, the storm was full whiteout. My boots were soaked through and the heat in the truck had stopped working halfway. I signed in at the checkpoint and the guard gave me a puzzled look. "Commander, where's your jacket? Loaned it to someone who needed it more," I said. He grinned like he thought it was a joke. That night I sat in the barracks with a blanket around my shoulders, trying to shake off the cold. I thought about that boy's face, the look when I zipped up the jacket. I figured that would be the end of it. Just a quiet act of kindness in a long winter. But the Navy doesn't work that way. Small things have a way of echoing up the chain of command, and sometimes they come back louder than you ever expect. A week later, the announcement came over the base PA. "All personnel, full uniform inspection. Admiral Hayes will be visiting from the Pacific Fleet." I groaned. Inspections under command were never good news. It meant no detail could be out of place, from the polish on your belt buckle to the way your ribbons aligned by 1/16 of an inch. I spent that night pressing a borrowed coat, checking every seam, hoping no one would notice it wasn't quite my fit. The next morning, the Admiral arrived. He wasn't a man you forgot easily, tall, silver-haired, a presence that carried years of command. The kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to make everyone straighten. He walked the line, slowly stopping in front of each officer, murmuring a few words, then moving on. When he reached me, his boots stopped inches from mine. I kept my eyes front, heart hammering so hard I thought he could hear it. He studied me for a long time, then spoke quiet, almost personal. "Lieutenant Commander Hart?" "Yes, sir." His gaze didn't waver. "Your jacket? It's in my house." A few officers glanced over, confused. My throat tightened. "Sir?" He gave a faint smile. "We'll talk later." Then he moved down the line. I stood there, motionless, heat rushing to my face even in that freezing hangar. My mind spun. How could the Admiral of all people have my jacket? When inspection ended, my senior officer whispered, "What was that about?" I had no answer. Only one thought circled in my head: the boy. Something in my chest told me this story wasn't over. The rest of that day felt longer than any mission I'd ever served. Every step I took around base felt like walking through fog, not the cold kind that stings your eyes, but the kind that crawls into your mind and sits there. I kept replaying the Admiral's words. "Your jacket, it's in my house." It didn't sound like a reprimand. His tone wasn't angry. If anything, it carried a quiet warmth that unsettled me even more. Admirals don't usually speak warmly to junior officers, not in inspection lines, not ever. Still, the rumor mill started before lunch. By mid-afternoon, half the logistics division had some version of the story. Heard the Admiral knows her family. No, she's related to someone in Fleet Command, or the best one, she's getting promoted for rescuing a cat in uniform. The Navy could move ammunition faster than truth. That evening, while I was checking warehouse inventory, I got a call from the base adjutant. "Lieutenant Commander Hart, report to Admiral Hayes's office at 1900 hours. My hand froze halfway through a clipboard check. I'd never been summoned to an admiral's private quarters in my entire career. When I arrived, the Marine outside his door gave me a sympathetic look like he already knew this would be memorable. I took a breath, adjusted my collar, and knocked. "Come in." The Admiral's office wasn't like the other command rooms, no steel desks or blinding fluorescents. It looked more like a quiet study lined with maps, a model destroyer, and framed photographs of his family in uniform. The smell of old leather and pipe tobacco hung faintly in the air. Admiral Hayes stood by the window, his hands behind his back, looking out at the snow still falling over the pier lights. "Commander Hart," he said without turning, "thank you for coming." "Sir," I stood at attention. He finally turned around, and that look, the same one from inspection, returned. Calm, observant, like he could see the whole picture before anyone else did. He gestured to a chair. "At ease. Sit down." That alone felt foreign. Admirals didn't ask, they ordered. I sat carefully, unsure what to do with my hands. He leaned against his desk, crossed his arms, and said quietly, "A week ago during that blizzard, you stopped at a small store off Route 9, correct?" "Yes, sir." "You gave your issued Navy jacket to a child there." "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly as though confirming something to himself. Then he stepped behind the desk and picked up a small object, a folded piece of dark blue fabric with a familiar gold name tag, Hart. My breath caught. "Sir, how?" He smiled faintly. "My grandson Ethan came home wearing it." It took a full second for his words to make sense. My mind replayed the boy's face, the blue eyes, the trembling hands, the way his mother looked at me like I'd saved her world. The Admiral continued, voice low and steady. "That night he wandered away from our cabin after an argument. My daughter was frantic. When we found him, the only thing keeping him from freezing was this." He laid the jacket down gently. "He told us a Navy lady gave it to him. Said you called him Sailor." My throat tightened. "Sir?" "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," he interrupted softly. "You just did what a good officer does, saw someone cold and acted." He studied me again longer this time, and I could feel the weight of his gaze. "You reminded me that service doesn't end at the base gate. My family owes you more than we can say." I was speechless. Words felt too small for the moment. I wanted to tell him I didn't deserve thanks, that anyone in uniform would have done the same, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have stopped. After a pause, he gestured toward a framed photo on the shelf, him with a woman and 2 children standing in front of a naval cruiser. "That's my daughter, Captain Rachel Hayes. Ethan's mother. She asked to meet you when she visits the base next week." I hesitated. "Sir, that's not necessary." He shook his head. "It's already arranged." Then, as if to shift the tone, he walked back around the desk and said with a small grin, "You can't wear that jacket anymore. Security will issue you a new one." That was the first time I ever saw a 4-star admiral smile like a father. When I left his office, the hallway felt strangely brighter even under the dim nightlights. I walked outside, and the cold air hit me like the first deep breath after a storm. It wasn't about the jacket. It wasn't even about the gratitude. It was something deeper, a reminder that sometimes kindness outranks command. I thought that was the end of the story. But that night over dinner at the mess hall, Commander Russo sat across from me with a smirk that cut right through the warmth I'd been feeling. Russo had been in logistics longer than anyone ambitious sharp, and the kind of officer who never forgot a promotion he didn't get. He'd lost one to me last year, and he'd been polite ever since too polite. "Word travels fast," he said, slicing into his steak. "The Admiral's little hero, huh? That'll look good on your next evaluation." "It's not like that," I replied evenly. "It was just a kid." "Sure," he said, smiling without looking up. "Just a kid, but you know how stories grow around here. Careful heart, the Navy loves heroes until it doesn't." His tone was light, but the warning was real. Russo didn't like feeling second in command. I set my fork down. "I didn't ask for attention, Commander." "I know," he said, sipping his coffee, "but you got it anyway." He smiled again, thin-practiced and full of something colder than the Kodiak wind. That night, lying in my bunk, I tried to shake it off. The Admiral's kindness, the gratitude from his family, it should have ended there. But somewhere deep down I could feel something shifting. Kindness draws light, but it also casts shadows. And in a place like the Navy, shadows can get you court-martialed. When Captain Rachel Hayes arrived the following week, the entire base seemed to stand a little straighter. Everyone knew who she was, the Admiral's daughter, a decorated officer in her own right, the kind of leader whose name carried weight even among veterans. I'd seen her on command briefings before, but never up close. Her presence was steady, confident, like someone who had spent a lifetime balancing family and service under the same flag. I wasn't nervous about meeting her until I saw the boy step out of the SUV beside her. Ethan, the same blue-eyed kid who'd been shivering outside that store. This time he looked warm, healthy, the sort of brightness you only see in a child who's been given a second chance. "Lieutenant Commander Hart," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Rachel Hayes. I believe you met my son." I stood at attention, then shook her hand firmly. "Ma'am, I'm glad he's all right." She smiled softly. "You saved him that night. We might not have found him in time without your jacket." Then she looked down at Ethan. "Go ahead, sweetheart." The boy stepped forward, holding something folded neatly in his hands. My Navy jacket, cleaned, pressed name tag still intact. "I thought you'd want it back," he said quietly. I knelt to meet his eye level. "You kept it safe for me, that means more than you know." He grinned, and for the first time I felt something loosen inside my chest, the quiet relief that comes when you realize the world still works the way it should. After that meeting, life seemed to settle again, at least on the surface. I went back to my usual rounds: inventory counts, requisition forms, fuel manifests. But there was an undercurrent now, something shifting in the way people looked at me on base. Some officers nodded respectfully, almost proud. Others whispered behind closed doors. In military life, goodwill can turn into suspicion faster than a storm over the Gulf. And no one carried that suspicion more clearly than Commander Russo. He stopped by the supply hangar 2 days later, hands clasped behind his back, inspecting crates like he owned the place. "Nice commendation from the Admiral," he said casually. "You planning to turn humanitarian full-time, or are you still in logistics?" I kept my tone even. "Just doing my job, sir." He smirked. "Sure, funny how doing your job can look like showing off to the right people." That was the first time I realized he wasn't just bitter, he was jealous. Jealous of the attention, jealous that something unplanned had earned me recognition he couldn't manufacture with all his reports and handshakes. A few days later, Captain Hayes invited me to dinner with her and the Admiral's family. I hesitated at first. Fraternization rules were tricky, and being seen too close to command could make enemies. But she insisted, saying it was informal, just gratitude. Their home sat just beyond the base gates, a modest, weather-beaten house overlooking the water, nothing ostentatious. Inside it felt warm, alive. Family photos lined the walls, generations of service uniforms, medals, and a few drawings that clearly came from Ethan. Dinner was simple: roast chicken, potatoes, and laughter that didn't sound rehearsed. The Admiral wasn't the stern man I'd seen in inspections. He laughed when his wife teased him about forgetting his own birthday, and his grandson clung to his arm like glue. It was strange being there. For so many years my life had been schedules, reports, silence. I'd forgotten what an ordinary evening with family sounded like. At one point, Mrs. Hayes placed her hand on mine. "Rebecca, my husband spent 40 years teaching officers to lead with strength. You reminded him and all of us that strength can also be quiet." I smiled politely, unsure what to say. Compliments in the Navy usually came in the form of adequate performance or satisfactory discipline. Warmth was rarer than sunlight in an Alaskan winter. But that warmth wouldn't last. The next morning I returned to base to find an email from the Office of Command Integrity. Subject Supply Audit. Irregularities detected. Immediate cooperation requested regarding missing fuel reports from Kodiak Station. My stomach dropped. I scrolled down. The flagged entries were all under my name. Falsified numbers. Unauthorized fuel transfers. Dates I knew for certain I hadn't even been on duty. I reread the message 3 times thinking there had to be a mistake, but the more I looked, the clearer it became someone had gone into the logs and changed my entries. There were only 2 people with access to that system, me and Commander Russo. That afternoon, Russo strolled into my office, arms crossed, smile sharp. Heard Command Integrity's asking questions, he said lightly. Rough way to start the week. Don't play dumb, Russo, I snapped. You know I didn't touch those records. He shrugged. Relax, Hart. I'm sure it's just an error. These things sort themselves out. Then he leaned closer, lowering his voice. Though I gotta say, it's ironic you saved the Admiral's grandson, and a week later you're stealing his fuel. Life's funny that way. Before I could respond, he turned and walked out, leaving the smell of coffee and arrogance behind. That night, I sat on the edge of my bunk, staring at the folded jacket hanging in my locker, the one Ethan had returned. The gold letters Hart seemed to glow faintly under the dim light. For years I'd believed that service was about discipline. Follow the rules, do the work, and justice follows. But sitting there in that freezing room, I realized sometimes doing right paints a target on your back. Still, I couldn't bring myself to be angry at the Admiral or his family. They didn't owe me anything. The anger I felt was directed squarely at Russo, the kind of man who twisted goodness into ammunition. And yet even then I didn't think of revenge. Not yet. Back then all I wanted was truth, clean, simple, and undeniable. The storm outside thickened again that night, snow whipping across the window, the wind howling against the tin roof. Somewhere out there a family was warm because I gave something away. Inside I sat shivering, wondering if I'd just lost everything for the same reason. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes I saw numbers, forms, signatures, lines of data flashing red across my mind. I kept replaying each log entry, trying to figure out when or how it could have happened. But it didn't matter how many times I checked. The falsified records all traced back to my name. By morning the base felt colder than usual. Not from the weather, though the snow hadn't stopped, but from the way people looked at me. A few nods were missing. Conversations quieted when I walked by. The Navy was a small world, and bad rumors moved through it like electricity. At 900 I was ordered to report to the administrative office. When I stepped inside, the atmosphere was tense. Commander Russo sat at the conference table beside a pair of officers from Command Integrity. He smiled faintly when he saw me, that practiced political kind of smile that hides poison underneath. Lieutenant Commander Hart, said the officer in charge, a man named Leary. We've received an anonymous report regarding irregularities in your supply records. Anonymous, I repeated, taking the seat across from him. Whoever wrote it was wrong. Leary's expression didn't change. Be that as it may, our initial review found discrepancies in your requisition forms and fuel distribution logs. Specifically, over 800 gallons unaccounted for between January 5th and 8th. That's impossible, I said. Those logs were verified by both me and Commander Russo. Leary glanced at Russo, who shrugged innocently. We'll verify that during the review, he said. In the meantime, your promotion evaluation will be paused until we conclude the investigation. By the end of the meeting, my stomach felt like lead. I left without saying another word. Outside, the wind tore across the runway, snow swirling around my boots, as if the whole world wanted to bury me. In the barracks, I sat staring at my locker. The jacket Ethan had returned hung neatly inside its gold tag, catching the dim light. It looked like a symbol of pride one day, and now it just reminded me of how fragile that pride really was. When I joined the Navy, I believed integrity was a shield. Do your duty, keep your record clean, and the truth protects you. But standing there, I started to understand something harder. Sometimes the truth is the last thing anyone wants to hear. The investigation dragged on for weeks. I wasn't arrested, but the damage was already done. Assignments got lighter. People avoided eye contact. A few even asked me quietly what really happened. I kept working, checking inventory, writing reports, but every signature I penned felt like carving my own gravestone. Russo, meanwhile, seemed to grow friendlier, almost smug. He'd clap me on the shoulder in the mess hall, smiling for the audience, but his eyes said something else entirely. "I've got you." One evening after the warehouse closed, I caught him in the hallway. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. He stopped, tilted his head slightly, that faint smirk still glued to his face. "Doing what?" "Framing me. You think no one can see it, but I know you doctored those logs." Russo leaned closer, his breath carrying the faint scent of bourbon. "Careful, Hart. Accusing a superior without proof isn't a good look. You don't want to dig the hole deeper." "Truth has a way of surfacing," I said. "Sure," he replied, stepping back. "But by the time it does, no one will care." He left me standing there, the hum of the base generators filling the silence. I wanted to shout, to punch something, to demand justice, but rage doesn't fit well inside a uniform. The Navy teaches you to hold the line, not break it. A week later, I was called to the Admiral's office again. My hands were shaking when I saluted. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "you've served this command with distinction. But there's pressure from above. Until the inquiry's complete, I have no choice but to suspend you from active duty." It felt like being punched without contact. "Sir, with respect, I didn't falsify anything." He sighed. "I believe you. But right now it's not about belief, it's about protocol. I'll make sure the process is fair." His eyes held genuine regret, and that almost made it worse. He was one of the few who still believed me, but even admirals had rules to follow. When I stepped outside, the base looked smaller than ever. The sky was gray, the snow turning to slush, and the wind cut straight through my borrowed coat. I walked to the end of the pier, the ocean heaving below, thinking about all the years I'd given to this uniform. Service wasn't supposed to feel like exile. That night I called my father. We hadn't spoken in months. He was a retired foreman from a shipyard in Virginia, a hard man, proud but simple in his morals. He answered on the second ring. "Rebecca, you still alive up there?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a small laugh. "Barely." We talked for a while about the weather, the usual small talk people use when they don't know how to start real conversations. Then I told him what happened. He was quiet for a long time before he finally said, "You remember what I told you when you joined?" I smiled bitterly. "That the Navy would eat me alive." "No," he said, "that the Navy would test you, and when it does, you'll find out who you are." I didn't answer. "You did right by that boy," he continued. "Don't let someone else's lie make you forget that." His voice cracked slightly. "You can lose your rank, your title, but not your honor. That's yours to keep." When the call ended, I sat in silence. The old man didn't say much, but somehow his words anchored me more than any medal or order ever could. By morning, I decided I wouldn't hide. If Russo wanted to destroy me, he'd have to do it in the open. I went back to work, even with suspension papers pending, and finished every task I could. I signed forms, double-checked manifests, and kept my head high. And in that calm before the storm, I made myself a promise I wouldn't fight him with anger. I'd fight him with proof. I didn't know yet that proof was already on its way, carried not by me but by a voice I hadn't heard since that snowy night. Suspension felt like a punishment I hadn't earned. My days stretched into long, silent hours, filled with paperwork no one would read. The uniform I once wore with pride now hung untouched in my locker, as if it belonged to someone braver, someone untainted. But duty is a habit that doesn't fade easily. I still reported to the warehouse, helping the enlisted staff organize crates and maintenance supplies. Officially, I wasn't supposed to be there. Unofficially, I couldn't sit in my quarters waiting for my name to rot. It was late one night when I saw him, Miller, the base janitor. A man in his 60s with weathered hands and a limp from an old deployment. He'd been with the Navy longer than I'd been alive. He always worked quietly, pushing his mop down endless corridors, nodding politely to everyone but rarely speaking. That night I found him sweeping the corner near the fuel office where most of the logs were stored. "Evening, Commander," he said with a respectful nod. "You're still here after dark again." "Couldn't sleep?" I replied, managing a tired smile. "What about you?" He chuckled. "Sleep's overrated once your knees start talking louder than your conscience." I smiled faintly, ready to move on, until he said something that stopped me cold. "You know, it's funny," he murmured. "The other night I saw Commander Russo hanging around here long after hours. Must have been close to midnight. He had your file open on the terminal. My pulse quickened. You're sure about that? Miller nodded slowly. He looked jumpy, kept checking the hallway. I didn't think much of it till I heard what they're saying about you. I leaned against the wall, my breath visible in the cold air. You'd be willing to repeat that? He frowned. If it clears your name, yeah. Man like him gives the Navy a bad name. We didn't serve to see good officers buried by cowards. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to hope. The next morning, I wrote a formal statement summarizing what Miller had seen. I knew it wasn't solid proof yet, but it was the first real crack in Rousseau's wall of lies. Meanwhile, word reached me through one of the junior officers that the Admiral's family had heard about my suspension. Apparently, Ethan had asked his mother why the lady with the jacket wasn't coming to dinner anymore. The story must have reached the Admiral himself because 2 days later I received a sealed message. Report to command office, confidential meeting. When I arrived, Admiral Hayes was standing near his desk reading something in silence. He didn't look up until I saluted. At ease, he said. We've received conflicting statements regarding your case. You'll be notified of a hearing date. Yes, sir. He studied me for a long moment. I read your service record again last night. There's not a single blemish in 10 years. That counts for something. Thank you, Admiral. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. You know my grandson still prays for you every night. Says you're the reason he's not afraid of the dark anymore. That caught me off guard. For all the storms I'd faced lately, that single sentence broke through the noise. Tell him I said softly that his courage that night was all his own. The Admiral nodded, but his eyes said more than his words. Something in him had already shifted. Later that week, as the snow melted into slush around the base, Miller's statement was officially filed. The Integrity Office reopened the investigation. I wasn't told the details, but whispers spread fast the forensic techs had found evidence that the logs were accessed from Rousseau's credentials. Rousseau didn't speak to me after that, but I could feel the tension in every hallway. He walked faster, barked orders louder, avoided my eyes. One evening I caught him outside the officers' quarters staring at the horizon. His tone was almost casual. You really think this'll end well for you, Hart? I don't have to think, I said. I just have to tell the truth. He smirked. Truth's just another tool, Lieutenant. You'll learn that when it stops working for you. Maybe, I said quietly, but I'd rather lose with it than win without it. He didn't answer. He just walked away, shoulders stiff as if the snow itself were mocking him. Days passed. Then one morning a courier arrived at my quarters with a plain envelope stamped confidential. Inside was a single sheet. Formal hearing scheduled, evidence submitted, all officers to appear. I didn't sleep that night either, but this time it wasn't fear keeping me awake. It was clarity. The Navy had taught me discipline, but kindness had taught me something stronger, the power of quiet persistence. Somewhere inside I remembered my father's voice. You can lose your rank, your title, but not your honor. I wasn't sure if this would restore my career, but I knew one thing: Rousseau had built his career on deceit. And deceit always leaves fingerprints. As dawn broke over the icy harbor, I walked toward the hangar. The light on the water looked softer that morning, like the world was finally thawing after a long freeze. Maybe, just maybe, truth was beginning to wake up too. The day of the hearing arrived gray, and still the kind of morning when the sea and sky melt into one sheet of steel. I stood outside the administrative building, gloved hands clasped behind my back, waiting for my name to be called. The wind whipped across the base flagpole, snapping the stars and stripes sharply in the air. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady. When you've already lost everything that can be taken from you, fear doesn't have much left to feed on. Inside the hearing room, a long table stretched between us. On one side sat the Board of Inquiry, 3 senior officers, and a legal advisor. At the head sat Admiral Hayes, expression unreadable, his eyes cool and distant. On the other side sat Commander Rousseau, crisp uniform shoes polished to mirrors, posture rehearsed. I took my seat in silence. The hum of the overhead light was the only sound. The lead officer, Captain Shaw, began reading the charges: falsification of supply records, breach of command integrity conduct unbecoming of an officer. The words rolled off like distant thunder. Lieutenant Commander Hart Shaw said, "You may begin your defense." I stood palms flat against the table. With respect, sir, I have never falsified a single record in my service. My reputation and performance are documented through 10 years of active duty. I've dedicated my career to this command, and I can prove I'm innocent. Russo leaned back, slightly feigning boredom. That's a strong statement, he said, his voice smooth. Truth usually is, I replied. The board reviewed the digital logs. Russo explained that I had been the only officer authorized to finalize the transactions during that week, therefore the missing fuel was clearly mishandled. His tone was calm, almost friendly, as if this were a training exercise rather than an accusation that could end a career. Why would I falsify those records, I asked. There's no motive, no gain. My record speaks for itself. Russo smiled faintly. You tell me, Hart. Maybe a little side deal with the depot. You've always been generous, giving away jackets, maybe supplies too. That line stung more than I'd expected. The jab was subtle but deliberate, turning my kindness into mockery. Before I could respond, Admiral Hayes raised a hand. Enough, Commander. Keep this professional. Russo saluted stiffly, though I could see his jaw tighten. The hearing dragged for over an hour. They went through every shipment, every signature, every timestamp. My mind drifted between the present and that frozen night outside the store, the boy, the snow, the jacket. I wondered if compassion had cursed me, or if it was the only thing keeping me from losing myself completely. Then, halfway through the proceedings, the adjutant entered quietly and handed the Admiral a sealed envelope. He opened it, scanned the pages, and looked up not at Russo but at me. Commander Russo, he said evenly, when did you last access the base fuel database? Russo blinked. Sir, I review it routinely as part of oversight. Why? The Admiral nodded to Captain Shaw. Read it. Shaw opened the document and began forensic analysis of access logs, confirms unauthorized modifications made on January 7th from Commander Russo's credentials. Supporting statement attached from Chief Maintenance Officer Harold Miller, witness to Commander Russo's after-hours presence at 2310. The room went silent. Russo's face drained of color. This is absurd, he said quickly. That system's shared anyone could have. Enough. The Admiral's voice cut through like ice. You accused one of my officers based on falsified data. You doctored those records to sabotage a subordinate. Do you deny it? Russo opened his mouth, but no words came out. The room seemed to shrink around him. I stood quietly, hands clasped, heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just breathed slowly, letting the truth do what revenge never could. The Admiral turned toward me. Lieutenant Commander Hart, your record is hereby cleared. Effective immediately, your suspension is lifted and your name restored. I saluted. Thank you, sir. My voice came out steady, though I could feel tears stinging at the back of my eyes. Russo was ordered to surrender his command pending disciplinary review. As he rose, he shot me a look filled with cold fury, the kind of look that could only come from a man defeated by his own weapon. He passed by without a word. For once, silence felt like justice. When the board adjourned, I stepped outside into the pale afternoon light. The air smelled of salt and thawing ice. A faint breeze lifted off the harbor, carrying the cries of seagulls overhead. For the first time in months, I felt the weight ease off my shoulders. Admiral Hayes followed a moment later. He walked beside me without speaking until we reached the edge of the pier. I owe you an apology, he said finally. You showed more composure under attack than some admirals I've served with. That's not just strength, Lieutenant, that's character. Thank you, sir, I said quietly. He nodded toward the horizon. My father used to say, there's no revenge purer than truth. He was right. I let the words sink in. The water shimmered under the afternoon sun, and for a fleeting second I thought of Ethan, the boy in the snow. How a single act of kindness had spiraled into all of this. Permission to speak freely, sir, I asked. Always. I don't regret helping that boy, I said, not even after everything that happened. The Admiral smiled faintly. I'd be disappointed if you did. We stood there for a while, two officers looking out over the frozen water, the silence between us more powerful than any ceremony. Then he turned to me. You've been recommended for reinstatement as operations officer. Congratulations, Commander. The title didn't matter as much as the tone he used when he said it, calm, respectful, proud. As he walked away, I looked out at the horizon again. The snow had stopped. The sea, once harsh and gray, glistened under a streak of sunlight. Justice hadn't come fast or easy, but it had come clean, quiet, and absolute. Spring arrived quietly in Kodiak. The air still carried a chill, but the snow had melted off the runways, leaving puddles that mirrored the sky. The gulls were back circling over the docks where the sea met the horizon, and the base that had once felt like a cage now hummed with calm again. I had been reinstated for a month when the Admiral invited me to dinner at his home. No uniform, his note had said. Just come as yourself. It was a Saturday evening, the kind of dusk that stretched slowly, painting everything gold. I hesitated outside their door for a moment. Same little house beyond the gates, same wooden steps, same wind chimes rattling softly in the breeze. I'd been here before once as a stranger accused of stealing and now as something else, though I still wasn't sure what. Mrs. Hayes opened the door with a warm smile. "Rebecca," she said, her voice full of kindness. "Come in, dear. He's been waiting for you." The smell of home cooking drifted through the hallway. Roast chicken again. Rosemary and butter and laughter echoed from the living room. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, a model ship halfway built beside him. When he saw me, his face lit up. "Commander Hart!" he shouted, running up to hug me. "Look what I built!" I laughed, kneeling beside him. "That's a fine destroyer, sailor. You'll have my job in 10 years. He grinned proudly, and I noticed what he was wearing. My navy jacket sleeves, still a little long but freshly cleaned, the gold name tag glinting faintly in the lamplight. The Admiral entered the room, then slower than usual, a soft pride in his eyes. "He refuses to take that thing off," he said. "We tried everything. He says it's lucky." Ethan looked up. "It's not lucky, Grandpa, it's brave." Everyone laughed quietly, but in the Admiral's eyes I saw a glimmer of something deeper, the same gratitude that had lived there since that winter day. Over dinner, conversation flowed easily. They asked about the base, about the new recruits, about how I was settling back into my role. The Admiral teased his wife for burning the rolls again. Ethan told a story about trying to salute his teacher at school. And somewhere in that easy rhythm I realized something I'd spent years believing: the Navy was about rank structure, precision, about getting everything right. But sitting there surrounded by warmth and laughter, I understood it was also about the things you couldn't measure: kindness, loyalty, quiet courage. Quiet. After dinner we moved to the porch. The sky was streaked with violet, the sound of waves faint in the distance. The Admiral stood beside me, hands clasped behind his back. "You know," he said, "I've commanded ships, fleets, and men across 3 oceans. But the thing I'll remember most from this winter isn't a mission or a medal." "What's that, sir?" He smiled. "A young officer who gave away her jacket without expecting anything in return. You reminded me that leadership isn't about control, it's about heart." For a long moment we just stood there. The wind brushed across the porch, cool but gentle, carrying the smell of salt and pine. I thought about that hearing a lot, I admitted. For a while I was angry. At Rousseau, at the system, even at myself. But now I think, maybe it happened the way it needed to. He nodded slowly. "You found out what kind of person you really are. Most people go their whole careers without learning that." I looked at him. "And what about Rousseau?" "Dishonorably discharged," he said simply. "The record will speak for itself. But we don't need to speak of him anymore." There was nothing vengeful in his tone, just closure, clean and final. As the evening deepened, I got ready to leave. Mrs. Hayes hugged me like family. Ethan stood in the doorway, still wearing the jacket. "Keep it," I told him softly. "It suits you." He shook his head firmly. "No, ma'am. Grandpa says uniforms should stay where they belong." He carefully folded it just as I had the day I first wore it and placed it in my hands. "It's yours," he said, "but I'll remember." I knelt down, brushing a bit of hair from his forehead. That's all I could ever ask for, sailor. On the drive back to base, the roads were empty. The radio hummed quietly, an old country song about home and second chances. I rolled down the window, letting the cold air fill the truck. Somewhere along the coast, the clouds broke, and a soft beam of moonlight cut through the mist. I thought about my father's words again. "You can lose your rank, your title, but not your honor." He'd been right. Honor wasn't something the Navy gave me. It was something I had to protect even when the world tried to take it away. At the base gate, the guard saluted as I passed through. For once, I didn't feel like just another officer on the roster. I felt whole. I parked by the pier and stepped out, walking to the edge where the sea whispered against the dock. The water was calm silver under the moonlight. I could see my reflection in it, tired, older maybe, but steady. I thought of Ethan, of the Admiral, of that first night when I'd handed over my jacket without thinking twice. A small gesture, one I barely remembered at first, had become the thread that pulled everything together. Compassion, truth, justice. And maybe that's what life was, not about grand victories, but about quiet acts that ripple outward until they reach someone who needs them. Before I turned to leave, I whispered softly into the wind. Not every battle is fought with anger. Some are won with kindness, and time delivers the rest. If you believe in quiet courage and doing the right thing even when no one's watching, share this story with someone who served, or someone who's lost faith in decency. Maybe they just need to be reminded that honor still matters. And if these stories speak to your heart, subscribe, leave a comment, or simply tell me where you're listening from. Because sometimes the smallest stories carry the biggest truths.